In 1453, after the fall of Constantinople, a Genoese merchant recorded something that haunted European courts for decades. He witnessed Ottoman soldiers systematically separating the wives of defeated Byzantine warriors from their children. But death wasn't their fate. What happened next was a calculated program of psychological destruction that the Ottomans had perfected over centuries. These women faced a fate so horrific that many historians refuse to document it fully until now. The Genoese. Merchant's name was Giacomo Tadaldi, and his eyewitness account provides one of the most detailed Western records of Ottoman conquest practices. But Tadaldi wasn't alone in documenting these horrors. Diplomatic correspondence, survivor testimonies, and Ottoman administrative records reveal a systematic approach to dealing with the families of defeated enemies. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer territories, they conquered bloodlines. When a city fell, Ottoman commanders had detailed protocols for handling different categories of captives. Male warriors were typically executed or enslaved, but their wives faced something far more calculated. These women weren't just spoils of war. They were strategic assets in a psychological warfare campaign designed to prevent future rebellions and demonstrate Ottoman power to neighboring kingdoms. What happened to them was documented, systematic, and deliberately designed to create maximum suffering. The process began immediately after conquest with what Ottoman records call family dissolution. Wives of defeated warriors were forcibly separated from their children, often within hours of their husbands' deaths on the battlefield. This separation wasn't random chaos. It was methodically organized. Ottoman officials had lists prepared in advance, identifying the families of military leaders, nobles, and influential warriors. These women were considered high-value targets for psychological destruction. Children under age 10 were taken for the Dev-Sherm system, the Ottoman practice of converting Christian children into Muslim soldiers and administrators. But the mothers were told their children had been killed, creating immediate and devastating psychological trauma. The women were then transported to holding facilities where they underwent what Ottoman documents describe as identity erasure. They were stripped of their clothing, jewelry, and any personal items that connected them to their previous lives. Even their names were taken away and replaced with numbers or generic Turkish names. But this was just the beginning. The real psychological warfare was designed to destroy their sense of self completely, making them living examples of what happened to those who opposed Ottoman rule. What the Ottomans did next reveals the calculated nature of their psychological warfare. These women were subjected to what Ottoman administrative records call systematic demoralization, a step-by-step process designed to break their mental resistance completely. The first phase involved forced conversion ceremonies that were deliberately humiliating. The women were required to publicly renounce their Christian faith and declare loyalty to the Sultan. Those who refused faced starvation, but those who complied were told they had betrayed their dead husbands and dishonored their families. The second phase was designed to destroy their maternal instincts. They were forced to care for Ottoman children while being told repeatedly that their own children were dead. Some were even required to nurse the babies of Ottoman soldiers, the same men who had killed their husbands. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating tactic was the false hope system. Periodically, Ottoman officials would tell these women that their children were alive and could be reunited, but only if they performed increasingly degrading tasks or provided information about resistance networks in their home regions. This created a cycle of hope and despair that many survivors described as worse than physical torture. The women would comply with demands only to be told that their children had actually died years earlier, or that they needed to do just one more thing to earn the reunion. The third phase of this systematic destruction involved forced marriages to Ottoman soldiers or administrators. But these weren't marriages in any recognizable sense. They were psychological torture disguised as legal unions. The women were forced to marry men who had participated in the conquest of their cities, sometimes even the soldiers who had killed their husbands. Ottoman records show this was intentional. Officials believed that forcing these women to live with their enemies would break their spirits completely. These marriages came with specific rules designed to maximize psychological damage. The women were required to cook meals using recipes from their homeland. But for the men who had destroyed their families, they had to maintain Ottoman households while being constantly reminded of their previous lives. Many were forced to bear children with their Ottoman husbands, creating an impossible emotional conflict. They loved their new children, but knew that these same children represented the eraser of their original families and identities. The most cruel aspect was that any sign of grief or mourning for their dead husbands was punished severely. They had to appear grateful for their new lives while suppressing all evidence of their trauma and loss. The psychological destruction didn't end with the original victims. Ottoman records reveal that this system was designed to create lasting trauma that would affect multiple generations and serve as a permanent warning to potential enemies. One of the most documented cases involves a woman known only as Martyr of Trebizond in Ottoman records. After the fall of Trebizond in 1461, Martyr was the wife of a Byzantine military commander who died defending the city walls. Ottoman documents detail her processing with clinical precision. Martyr was told her 3 young children had been executed, when in reality, they had been taken for the dev-share system. She was forced to marry an Ottoman janissary named Miti, who had personally participated in the siege that killed her husband. For 15 years, she was required to cook Byzantine recipes for Miti's dinner parties, where Ottoman officers would mock the weakness of Byzantine culture. The most heartbreaking detail comes from a letter Marta hid inside a wall of her Ottoman home, discovered during renovations in 1987. She wrote, "I dream of my children's faces every night, but I can no longer remember their voices. Me tells me I should be grateful for my new life, and I smile and agree. But inside I die a little more each day. I have borne him 2 sons, and I love them. But they will never know their mother was once free." The children born from these forced marriages faced their own psychological torment. Martyr's Ottoman-born sons, Ali and Osman, grew up knowing their mother had been a conquered person, but they were raised as loyal Ottomans. Ottoman court records document that Ali eventually became a janissary himself, but suffered from what officials described as strange melancholies, where he would stare at Byzantine ruins for hours. Many of these children reported feeling torn between 2 identities, Ottoman by law, but carrying the hidden grief of their mothers. A surviving account from Osman, written when he was an adult, describes the confusion. "My mother would sometimes weep while cooking, but when I asked why, she would smile and say she was happy. I knew she was lying, but I could never understand what made her so sad." The mothers were forbidden from teaching their children about their original cultures, languages, or religions. Any attempt to pass down stories about their homeland or dead fathers resulted in severe punishment. Martyr was caught teaching her Ottoman-born son a Byzantine lullaby and was publicly whipped as an example to other women. This created a generation of children who sensed their mother's hidden pain but could never understand its source. Many of these children developed behavioral problems, anxiety, and what Ottoman physicians called inherited melancholy, depression that seemed to have no obvious cause. Another documented case involves Elena of Mora, whose story was recorded by a Venetian merchant who knew her family before the Ottoman conquest of 1460. Elena was forced to marry the Ottoman administrator, who had ordered her husband's execution. She was required to manage the same administrative building where her husband had been tortured before his death. Elena's psychological breakdown was gradual, but documented in Ottoman medical records. She began talking to empty rooms, convinced her dead husband was still alive and working in the building. Ottoman physicians noted that she would set a place for him at dinner and become agitated when told he wasn't coming home. Rather than providing treatment, Ottoman officials used Elena as a teaching example for newly conquered women. They would bring recent captives to see her condition and explain that this was what happened to women who refused to accept their new reality. Some women developed what Ottoman physicians described as melancholy madness, a condition we would now recognize as severe depression and PTSD. They would stare blankly for hours, refuse to eat, or speak to people who weren't there. Medical records describe women who would rock back and forth while humming songs from their homeland, or who would compulsively clean the same area repeatedly while muttering prayers in their native languages. The most heartbreaking accounts come from the few written records left by these women themselves. Hidden letters discovered in archaeological excavations reveal mothers writing to children they would never see again, or documenting their experiences in hopes that someday the truth would be known. One such letter found in the walls of a house in former Ottoman territory reads to my daughter Maria, "If God wills that you still live. I was told you died when the city fell, but I choose to believe you escaped. I write this so that if we meet in heaven, you will know that your mother never stopped loving you, never stopped being your mother, even when they forced me to become someone else. They can change my name and my clothes and my husband, but they cannot change my heart." What makes this historical injustice even more disturbing is the sheer scale of the operation and the bureaucratic precision with which it was implemented. Ottoman conquest records show that this systematic psychological destruction was applied across 3 continents over more than 400 years with detailed documentation that reveals the calculated nature of these crimes. Conservative estimates suggest that over 100,000 women were subjected to this treatment during major Ottoman conquests, but recently discovered administrative records suggest the actual number may have been much higher. A 2018 analysis of Ottoman tax records found references to converted households that indicate systematic processing of conquered families on a massive scale. Each conquest followed the same pattern: separation, identity erasure, forced conversion, psychological manipulation, and forced marriage. But the Ottomans refined their methods over time, learning from each campaign to maximize psychological damage. The most chilling evidence comes from training manuals discovered in the Ottoman State Archives in Istanbul. These documents, written for provincial administrators, contain step-by-step instructions for implementing psychological warfare tactics. One manual dated 1521 includes a section titled "Methods for Ensuring Complete Submission of Enemy Wives." The manual specifies that the breaking of maternal bonds must be immediate and absolute, and provides detailed timelines for each phase of psychological destruction. It recommends telling women their children are dead for exactly 6 months before revealing they are alive, as this creates optimal despair, followed by desperate gratitude. Regional governors would send quarterly reports back to Constantinople, detailing the success rates of different psychological destruction methods. These reports, written in the cold language of bureaucracy, describe human suffering with the same tone used for crop yields or tax collection. A report from the governor of Waqia in 1594 states the implementation of the new maternal separation protocols has resulted in a 40% increase in compliance rates among noble wives. The false death notification system proves particularly effective with mothers of male children aged 5 to 10 years. They measured success not by compliance, but by how completely they could break a woman's connection to her previous identity. success was defined as the point where a woman would actively participate in Ottoman culture without coercion and show no signs of mourning for her previous life. The Ottomans even conducted what we would now recognize as psychological research. They documented which types of women were most resistant to their methods and developed specialized techniques for different categories of victims. Noble women required different treatment than peasant wives, and mothers of multiple children needed different approaches than childless women. One particularly disturbing document discovered in 2019 contains detailed observations about the psychological effects of different separation techniques. It notes that women who were allowed to say goodbye to their children were more likely to maintain hope and resist psychological breaking, while those who were separated without warning showed faster rates of identity dissolution. The system was so effective that very few organized resistance movements emerged from conquered territories. The psychological trauma inflicted on these women served as a warning that spread far beyond the immediate victims, creating fear that prevented rebellions before they could begin. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was how this system was exported throughout the Ottoman Empire. Local administrators in distant provinces would request detailed instructions on implementing these psychological warfare tactics, and Ottoman officials would send specialists to demonstrate proper techniques. A letter from the governor of Egypt in 1517 requests an expert in the management of noble captives to help process the wives of defeated Mamluk commanders. The response preserved in Ottoman archives includes detailed instructions and the promise to send a specialist who has successfully processed over 200 Byzantine noble families. The bureaucratic nature of these crimes, the careful documentation, the systematic refinement of techniques, the training of specialists reveals that this wasn't wartime chaos or individual cruelty. It was state-sponsored psychological warfare, implemented with the same organizational efficiency used for tax collection or military logistics. This systematic program of psychological destruction continued for over 400 years, affecting hundreds of thousands of women across the Ottoman Empire. The trauma didn't end with the original victims. It created generational cycles of pain that lasted well into the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire finally abandoned these practices in the early 1800s, not from moral awakening, but because European diplomatic pressure made them politically costly. The last documented cases of forced family separation occurred during the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. But here's what historians are only now discovering. The Ottoman archives may contain evidence of even more systematic psychological warfare programs that were never fully documented. In 2022, ground-penetrating radar at former Ottoman administrative sites revealed hidden chambers containing thousands of personal items, jewelry, letters, children's toys that appear to have been systematically collected and stored. Chemical analysis of these artifacts shows they came from across the empire, suggesting a coordinated program to erase physical evidence of victims' previous identities. But why would the Ottomans preserve these items instead of destroying them? Recent translation of coded Ottoman documents suggests these personal belongings may have been used in even more sophisticated psychological manipulation, showing women their children's toys years later to break them when other methods failed. Which raises a disturbing question. If the Ottomans were willing to hide evidence of psychological warfare techniques that went beyond what they officially documented, what other systematic programs of human destruction are still buried in archives around the world, waiting to reveal how far civilizations have gone to break the human spirit?